Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Josh Mobley, and I'm joined today by our very own Rony Kozman. Rony is the Assistant Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Samford University, and he is the author of our recently released Adam's Wisdom and Israel's Law, Paul, Early Judaism, and Natural Law Tradition. Rony, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with us today.
Josh, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really excited to talk about your book. So your book is about natural law theory. And could you start off by letting us know what that is and also why it might be controversial?
Yeah, it's a great question. Part of the question of the controversy is what it is. So once you talk about, once I start giving you a definition of natural law, we're already wading into kind of controversial waters and territories.
That's called job security in academia, right? Is that we can keep arguing about this stuff forever.
That's right. So some aspects of the controversy are different definitions of natural law, what qualifies as a natural law theory or what doesn't qualify as natural law, or what is fundamental or essential to what makes something, a legitimate natural law theory. So that question, what is natural law, is heavily disputed. Maybe a really basic definition is something like universal moral knowledge, okay, which is kind of the working definition I work with. Now, again, some people, when they think about natural law, they think about basic moral principles that humans know, or basic like moral ideas or obligations or norms that humans know. And that's the basic definition that I'm working with. But other people, when they talk about natural law, will talk about the process that humans use to observe nature and then to like deduce or extract, particular moral principles, right? Now, how you define natural law is now going to result in whether you find it when you do a historical investigation of a text, right?
Yes.
And so some people have, when they're thinking about like particular ancient Jewish or Christian texts, they might have a particular definition of natural law in mind and then say, oh, there's nothing that's really natural law in these texts. So the first piece maybe to think about is there are different versions of natural law. There are different natural law ideas. The most famous one, obviously, is that of Aquinas, right? And so that's the one that we might call him the popularizer of natural law, right? In Christian theology, especially. So I think his definition is important for us to kind of like have an idea of and to work with. Obviously, he's not the first to have a kind of natural law idea. If we're talking about universal moral norms that include like obligations that humans have, and I think even not only to other people, so ways you should treat and shouldn't treat other humans fall within the category of natural law, but then also how one's obligations towards God, I think, fall under natural law as well. Other people may call that natural theology or something like that, what we can know about God. But I think in these ancient Jewish texts and in the New Testament that obligations to God are just part of the moral obligations or the obligations that all humans have and all humans know, how they ought to worship God, avoid idolatry, and how they ought to treat their fellow neighbors. So that's kind of my working definition of natural law. Now, let me chase one thing here. Is that some people, and I think this is a mistake that is often made, again, a mistake depending on how you define natural law. Some people, when they're thinking about natural law, are thinking of naturalism. So they're thinking of like humans know moral precepts in a naturalistic way that's completely disjointed from revelation or from God. Now that may be one version of natural law. I guess we could have a naturalistic version of natural law, but we're not going to find that version of natural law really I think in biblical tradition. It's not even how Aquinas would think about natural law.
Yeah.
or the Stoics, really, right? So when we're talking about natural law, it doesn't mean that it is only purely natural and has nothing to do with God.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder. So when I think of natural law, obviously, I also think of Thomas Aquinas, medieval Aristotelianism, and that key distinction that he wants to maintain between natural law and revealed law. But part of your argument here is that natural law is present throughout the Hebrew Bible in many different instances. And so, given your own kind of working definition of natural law, this kind of universal moral code or obligation imposed upon all creatures, what are some examples then of natural law that you see at work in the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, sure. I think a good way to maybe to begin in this kind of like quest where we see natural law in the Bible is to think, well, we have a bunch of examples before we even get to the, let's say, revealed written law of Sinai. We have a number of examples in the book of Genesis, let's say, right? And even in the early chapters of Exodus, where humans are expected to know things, right? Things that they should and shouldn't do. And they are held culpable when they violate those certain norms. So, like, for example, Cain and Abel. And again, this stuff is not new to me, right? With the stuff I'm talking about, I'm depending on others. David Novak makes this point. Who's a very prominent Jewish philosopher and theologian who's done a lot of work on natural law in Judaism. But even Origen, right, the church father Origen, when he's thinking about Genesis, he'll read the story of Cain and Abel, and he'll see how Cain murders his brother Abel, and that Cain knew there was basically a norm, a commandment, a law that Cain knew that he should not harm his brother. When we get to the story of Noah and the flood, right, we see that the inhabitants of the earth, they are, the language we read in Genesis 6 and 8 is that every intention of the thoughts of the hearts of humans is bent only on evil or on evil all the time or continually. And so this idea that humans, they know they shouldn't do these evil things, and yet, the story of Noah and the flood is about how humans have corrupted the earth and filled it with violence and injustice. And so God is going to hold humans accountable for violating a standard of justice that is known, right, in the narrative, is known to all humans, even apart from the revelation at Sinai. We could keep going, right, in the book of Genesis. I love the example of when God wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and then Abraham gets into this argument with God. So Abraham says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And so there we have an example, which I think this is fascinating, where Abraham is even trying to hold God, right, to this this bar of justice, right?
Yeah.
This principle that not only humans are obligated to, but also even God himself. So those are just some examples from the narrative of Genesis.
Okay, so that's fascinating. And I guess one way of thinking would be that if you think of Moses as the kind of paradigmatic figure of someone who receives revealed law, then that would contrast perhaps to someone like Adam, who is in the garden, and there is not necessarily revealed law so much as this kind of sense of what's given to Adam is given to all humanity. But you highlight a really great, fascinating. I loved this section of your book, this very ancient stream of commentary that actually saw Adam and Moses as both receiving some kind of law. Adam in the form of wisdom, Moses in the form of Torah. And so could you talk then about the relationship between Adam and Moses and how Adam is understood in this tradition emerging in the Second Temple period?
Yeah, that's great. It is. We do often think of, Moses and Sinai as that's revealed law, right? Just as you expressed it, and then Adam or something. It's not revealed. Maybe there's something like natural law, but it's not revealed is how we tend to think of it. And I think in the Second Temple period, these two figures, Adam and Moses, or Adam and Israel, Eden and Sinai, these two places, they get mishmashed together. Sometimes they stand side by side in these Second Temple Jewish texts, and they're coordinated with each other. At other times, they're just like blended. So it's as though you have Adam is being addressed by Moses, like in Deuteronomy 30, where, Moses tells Israel that I've set before you life and death, good and evil, right? This kind of thing. And he enjoins on them to keep the commandments. Sometimes in the text, it's as if, Adam, human beings, humanity as a whole, it's as though they have the Sinaitic revelation. And so Sinai can even become, we tend to think of Adam as functioning in this universalistic strain. Adam can represent all humans or can represent Gentiles. But in these texts, it's like the particularistic and the universalistic are being bended so that even Israel, reception of the law, can be blended with Adam to represent all humanity's kind of, being confronted by the divine command. So it's an important tradition in the Second Temple period, I think, and it pops up, as I try to show in the book, it pops up repeatedly in a number of these texts.
So Sirach being one of them in particular, right, where it comes through very clearly, and sort of are arguing here, I think, that there's no real meaningful separation between natural and revealed law in this text. So how does Sirach then, and this is a quote, weave together the scriptural stories of Adam's creation and Israel's reception of the Torah?
Great. Let me also add one thing real quickly about Adam's wisdom, the tradition that we were talking about earlier, is that in ancient Jewish texts, Adam's wisdom, Adam's law, does not always signify natural law. So sometimes in some Jewish texts, like in some texts at Qumran, Adam is ignorant because he's formed from the dust.
Interesting.
Yeah, or because his dusty constitution kind of makes him unable to perceive the mysteries that are above. Or sometimes Adam's wisdom or revelation can signify a kind of esoteric knowledge that only the select few possess. So I just kind of want to make that qualification, is that Adam's wisdom, this revelation to Adam, can be used in different ways in early Judaism. It doesn't always signify natural law, but I'm focusing on the iterations, on the versions that seem to suggest a kind of Adam signifying a universal kind of knowledge.
You're pulling on one particular interpretive thread. Right. And there are certainly others in the period, and because these images and these stories are so multivalent, but you are crafting a single narrative of a particular way of understanding this. So I think we all fully understand that. And we're grateful that you have, because it's produced a really marvelous book.
Sure. Well, okay, so to get back to Sirach and what Sirach is doing. Sirach coordinates Adam and Israel like in three really momentous places. It's like a really prominent literary thing that, scholars have noticed this. It's in chapters 15, 17, and 24. Let me focus specifically on the two blends in chapter 15 and 17. And for the listeners who don't know, the book of Ben Sira is like a 2nd century BC text. It's kind of like the book of Proverbs, right? For those who aren't familiar with it, it's got a lot of these wise sayings. We have a sage who is giving his wisdom of what it means to progress and to be faithful to the Torah. I think that's kind of the basic, let's say, gist of the book of Ben Sira. But the sage in chapters 15 through 18, this is like a literary unit, is interacting with an interlocutor. He kind of gets into a bit of a debate. He's responding to someone who is trying to diminish human culpability. Or someone who's trying to argue that God would be unjust to hold humans culpable or responsible for sin. Okay. And the interlocutor, he has a number of arguments. Okay. So the interlocutor will say something like, God caused humans to sin. So that's one argument.
Yeah.
Okay, so if God causes humans to sin, then yeah, how could God hold humans responsible?
Right.
Or the interlocutor might suggest that humans are ignorant; they don't know what they ought to do, and if humans are morally ignorant, well, can they be held responsible or culpable for transgression? Or another kind of suggestion that the interlocutor makes is that God, he doesn't really care; he doesn't really see what humans do. I mean, like, humans are these tiny little creatures in the midst of an immense creation. So why is God concerned with what they do anyways? So all of these three arguments are kind of geared towards minimizing human culpability. And in response to that, the sage is going to, in chapters 15 through 18, weave together Adam's creation and Israel receiving the law at Sinai. And so he'll repeatedly weave together texts from Genesis 1 to 3 and then also like texts from Exodus 19 or 24 where Israel receives the law at Sinai, or Deuteronomy 30 where Moses, like I said earlier, addresses Israel and tells them, I've set before you life, or death, good and evil, and he tells them to keep the commandments. So he's going to repeatedly blend those things. In chapter 15, he does it, and in chapter 17, in order to combat the charge that God would be wrong to hold humans culpable. And so what he does is he says, in chapter 15, when God created humans, he placed them in the hand, as the language uses, in the power, in the hand of their deliberation. So humans, for Ben Sira, when God created them, and he's drawing from Genesis 1 and 2 here, when God formed Adam, he placed them in the hand of their deliberation, which means humans, in their created state, they know things, right? They can deliberate on good and evil, and they can choose which way they want to go, whether they want to do good or whether they want to do evil. And Ben Sira will say, before each person are life and death, and whichever one chooses will be given. Okay, life and death, right? Well, that sounds like Moses in Deuteronomy 30. I've set before you today life and death. But if he's already evoked Genesis, you might also think, well, we've heard of life and death in the opening chapters of Genesis, right? We have the tree of life, but then we have the consequence of death, right? And so are we talking about Adam? Or are we talking about Israel, right? We're blending the two together. And I think what this does is it takes the created human being, right, and suggests that, well, actually, God didn't force anyone to sin. In fact, and the sage is minimizing, in some ways, God's place in human decision to sin. Right. God set up humans so they can choose what they want to do, and they'll get rewarded for what they choose. So that's chapter 15, right? It's elevating human ability, human agency, that they can do what they want and they get the consequences for that. In chapter 17, then, we're going to get, again, the Lord created human beings out of the earth. So there we have a clear, right, reference to Genesis 1 and 2, and makes them return to it again. So this is from Genesis 2 and then 3, where we're told that humans are made from the earth, from dust, and to dust they will return. And then we read, he gave them a fixed number of days, but granted them authority over everything on earth. So that's Genesis 1, right? God makes humans and gives them authority to rule over the creatures of the earth. He gave them dominion over the beasts and birds in verse 4. But then you see this in verse 6, discretion and tongue and eyes, ears and a mind for thinking he gave them. Okay, so that's not in Genesis 1 and 2, right? But you might think it is from Genesis 6 and Genesis 8, where we read that the human being, the Adam's mind, right, is intent on evil, or the heart, or the thinking. So we do get some human rationality, so to speak, later in Genesis 6 to 8. And Genesis 2, where God forms Adam from the dust of the earth and breathes into him, right? And the Adam becomes a living being.
Yeah.
Well, the Hebrew text, this idea of forming, God forms Yetzar, is similar to Genesis 6 and 8, where we read of the formation of the hearts, the formation of the mind. And so I think what Ben Sira is doing, he's putting these two texts together. You see, when God formed Adam, he gave them a mind with which to think. And then he says in verse 7, he filled them with knowledge, understanding, and showed them good and evil. So here we have Adam filled with wisdom, right? With knowledge, with understanding, with good and evil, knowing what they should and shouldn't do. He put the fear of them into their hearts to show them the majesty of his works. Verse 11, he bestowed knowledge upon them and allotted to them the law of life. He established with them an eternal covenant. Verse 14, he said to them, beware of all evil, and he gave commandments to each of them concerning the neighbor. And we get language, their eyes saw his glorious majesty, and their ears heard the glory of his voice. So we begin with created Adam. And we get references to Genesis, and very quickly of their eyes seeing the glory of his majesty. Well, now we're in like Exodus 19 and 24, Israel at Sinai with the smoke and the glory, right?
Right.
And so he's blending the two. And again, the point is to elevate human knowledge, that humans know they've been enjoined with God's commandments. They've been filled with God's wisdom. They know they ought to worship God and how they ought to treat their neighbor. But he's going to pivot in verse 19. All their works are as clear as the sun before him, and his eyes are ever upon their ways. So not only do humans know what they should do, but God also knows, right? And he sees what humans do. So when we think about God filling humans with wisdom, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Right. On the one hand, it means humans know what they ought to do. But on the other hand, God's immanent wisdom also means that God knows and sees what they will do and will hold them accountable to that.
Right. So it becomes a source not only of the kind of imperative that, yeah, we ought to live this way and this is wisdom and this is going to lead to life, but it also becomes a source of perhaps judgment or at least accountability, as you've said. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk then. It does raise the question of justice. And it strikes me, and you bring this point out, that, you know, you have a natural law and then you have revealed law, but that there actually can, at times, it seems to be tensions between those things. And you bring this up in relation to 4 Ezra, and that 4 Ezra uses these tensions in relation to the question of justice. So how does the question of justice then shape the development of natural law theory in this period?
Yeah. In 4th Ezra, so I think 4th Ezra is really fascinating because just like in Ben Sira, where we have this kind of like response to an interlocutor who is questioning God's justice, in 4th Ezra, we have a very similar issue at play. So 4th Ezra is written at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century CE, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans. And so it's lamenting the injustice of what has happened to Israel. But it's using, right, it's using Ezra, right? And it's using the Babylonian destruction of Judah. That becomes the kind of narrative that's where Ezra is complaining about the injustice of God defeating Judah by the Babylonians. So again, the question of justice is an important one. And it's in the question of, is God just to punish us by using the Babylonians? It's in that context that the paradigm or the blend or the coordination of Adam's law and Israel's law comes up repeatedly in the dialogue and in the dispute between Ezra and the angel Uriel. Now, again, I think they get blended again a lot, right? So one of the things I want to press back against is again, I'm trying not to contrast natural law and revealed law. If that makes sense. I mean, there is a distinction that some of these texts make between the written form of law, which we have in the Torah, is the written form of law. But and sometimes we see that there are things that have been written in the law that are not known in the Adamic law, so to speak. Okay,
right.
But what I'm focusing on especially is the ways in which the written law, or the law of Sinai, is blended with the Adam's law. There's a lot of continuity. And the other thing that I want to press a little bit on is that when we say natural law, we have to be careful what we mean when we're comparing it to revealed law. So I would suggest that Adam's law is a revelation also in these texts.
Yeah.
Now, so like I mentioned, Ezra in this text is trying to argue that God has treated him and his people unjustly. And it's a fascinating debate between Ezra and Uriel as they kind of talk about this, dispute this traumatic event that's happened to the Jewish people. Ezra is going to use Adam's and Israel's law to emphasize God's injustice, whereas Uriel is going to use Adam and Israel and the coordination to actually emphasize God's justice. So they're going to be pulling on this juxtaposition to make different arguments, right? Let me give you maybe an example of what Ezra does. So Ezra is going to say, listen, God, and he's addressing God. He's not very happy with God. He says, you created Adam, you gave him a commandment, and he transgressed the commandment, and all those after him as well. And then he kind of gets us all the way to Israel as he recounts the history of Israel. He goes from Adam to those after him, and then gets us to Jacob, and then eventually to Israel, who comes to Sinai, and they receive the momentous revelation of God's commandments also, and they didn't do any better than Adam, Ezra says. So what he's done is he's got Adam's commandment and transgression and Israel's commandments, and they did just as poorly as Adam. And the reason is because, God, why didn't you think to remove the evil heart that Adam had and all those after him had? So there's this thing in 4th Ezra called the evil heart, or the evil thought that is in humans. And Ezra is going to say, so what that you gave Israel the law, you gave Adam commandment also, and Israel didn't do any better, because you, God, failed to remove the evil heart. And so then the logic is that God is unjust to punish Israel because it's his fault, right? He should have removed the evil heart. What good is it to give Adam and Israel commandments that they simply cannot keep, that they will inevitably fail? And so there you have Adam's commandment and Israel's commandment are being used to highlight God's injustice for Ezra.
Yeah.
He's also going to use Adam's commandment and Israel's law to argue that there is a common standard of justice over all humans, and that since there's a common bar of justice, he can then compare how the Gentile nations did with how Israel did. And what he's going to conclude is, yeah, sure, they're the rare Gentiles who keep God's commandment, Ezra is going to argue, but by and large, when we talk about the Gentile nations and when we talk about Israel as a whole, we have this Adam's law and Israel's law as this framework by which we can assess them. Ezra's going to say, yeah, Israel failed also, but they failed less miserably than the Gentiles. Okay, so they did a bit better. They didn't do great, but they did better. And so therefore, God, you are unjust to use the Gentiles to punish us. It's unjust for us to be punished at the hands of the Babylonians or the Romans, right, or the Gentile nations. You, God, should have used your own hand to punish us. is what Ezra says. So that's Ezra.
Yeah, so thank you for clarifying also that it isn't a contrast between the revealed law and natural law, that actually throughout these texts there is an enormous kind of blending of them, or a kind of sense in which they are operating on a continuum. And that seems to be, as you've just so helpfully outlined, precisely what Ezra is saying here, right? Is that because there is this kind of universal law that is given to all, then actually we can look at ourselves and at the Gentiles and ask, like, who's doing this better? You know, whether that's, I think we're about to get into whether or not that's a great way to ask the question, but that's at least that it's because of that continuity that they're able to grapple with these questions at this kind of universal level, I suppose. So take us then into the angel's response.
Okay, so Uriel, he's also going to use Adam's and Israel's law, right? So there's not really a dispute, right, about Adam's and Israel's law.
Yeah.
The dispute is going to be that whether this can be used to argue for God's justice or injustice, right? And so Uriel is going to say, no, actually, all humans know God's commandments. They have been placed in the human mind, including in Israel. And so all humans know what they should do, what they shouldn't do. And they even know Adam's law, so to speak, includes the knowledge of the eschatological punishments and rewards for keeping God's law or transgressing it. So Uriel's going to, maybe only a few can overcome the evil heart, but it's still possible. It's still within human grasp. So therefore, God's punishment is just and deserved, right? So that's kind of the thing that Uriel is going to stress over and over and over again.
Again, that double-edged sword of both guiding light for what we should do, but then also accountability and responsibility for what we haven't done or what we've done wrongly.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, so then all of this is happening, and then we get Paul, and this is probably the figure that most of our listeners are more familiar with. But Paul is also going to be playing along these same dynamics. He's going to be working with this same kind of tensions and continuities. So how does Paul, first century Jew, develop this understanding of natural law? And then what I'm really interested in is how does that then relate to the universal claims that Paul goes on to make about Christ, about the Spirit, about the consummation of the divine plan, etc.
Yeah. So in the book, I'm focusing especially on Paul's letter to the Romans, and I'm trying to argue that Paul is also he's indebted to this tradition of Adam's law and Israel's law, and he's blending or juxtaposing the two repeatedly in his letter, that it's actually a very important part, we might say foundation, that is in place and that he uses in order to even preach the gospel, right? The good news that he's going to proclaim. So I focus in the book, I argue that we see this Adam's law tradition in Romans 1 and 2 it comes up. I argue it comes up in Romans 5, verses 12 through 21, and then in Romans chapter 7, that those are kind of the three key important places that it comes up. Paul can use the Adam's law tradition both as representative, that Adam's knowledge is representative of what all humans know, and what, especially in chapter 1, what the Gentiles know. So the Gentiles know the expectations of piety and justice. In fact, in Romans 1:18, they are criticized that God's wrath is revealed against all impiety and injustice of human. Those two terms, I think, are very important, and this is a point that a couple of others have made also. But that the language of piety and justice in some Jewish texts are the two terms that summarize the Ten Commandments. So piety represents what the obligations that Israel has towards God, the first table of the Ten Commandments or of the law, and then justice can represent the obligations humans have towards others. So the second table of the commandments. And so what it seems is if that's correct, that in Romans 1, when Paul, I take it he's addressing Gentiles for their idolatry and for their impiety and injustice, is that God is holding Gentiles accountable, guilty for violating knowledge that they have. And in the book, I'm trying to make the case that Romans 1 is also indebted to Jewish traditions of Adam's worship, that in other Jewish texts, when Gentiles are criticized for their idolatry, we often get language from Genesis 1-3 is picked up. So this idea that Adam can represent that even Gentiles, all humans, know that they ought to worship God, which is exactly what Paul says in Romans 1, verses 18-32. They not only know their obligations to God, right, that they should give thanks to God, he says, right, that they should worship God, they shouldn't worship the creature, but they also know, Paul says at the end of chapter 1, they know God's righteous decree, God's righteous verdict, that those who do such things are worthy of death. So for Paul, it's not only the things, the vices and the virtues that he lists there, they also know the consequence for doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting to see Paul working within this context of an ongoing conversation, and one of the great virtues of your book is that you really bring out that Paul's situatedness within this multi-century conversation about natural law and revealed law and Adam and Moses. And so how does he then go on to develop that within Romans?
Yeah. So in Romans 1-2, obviously he's addressing an interlocutor in chapter 2, right? He turns to a you. This has become, disputed more recently in scholarship on Romans. But my reading is that he's addressing a Jewish you. And that what he's doing is what we're supposed to imagine, actually, that a large portion of his letter to the Romans contains the gospel that he would preach when he enters into the Jewish synagogue when he first arrives at Rome. So actually what he says in Romans 1 in the opening, right, of the letter is he says that he's eager to preach the gospel to them at Rome, and that he's not ashamed of the gospel, right? And I think what he's outlining here is, I think it's really actually helpful, at least for me anyways, others may be less persuaded of this, but it's helpful to imagine Romans 1, you can keep going all the way through the end of 11 even, that large portions of his letter to the Romans are, we imagine Paul entering the synagogue and actually addressing his fellow Jews, much like Jesus does, right, in the Gospels when he enters into the synagogues and he's addressing other Torah teachers. Yeah. I think that's what we should think he's doing. So he turns in Romans 2 to this Jewish you. And I think the idea is that the Jewish you that he's addressing thinks that he or Israel is safe compared to the Gentiles in the eschatological judgment, maybe even more righteous than the Gentiles, because they have been given the gift of Israel's written law. And so I think there's this idea that, well, we Israelites, this is the idea Paul is combating in Romans 1-2. He's trying to tell his fellow Jewish Torah teachers in the synagogue, as he kind of preaches this evangelistic, let's say, sermon, so to speak, is he's telling them, listen, the Torah didn't work. Israel's law did not work. It failed, and he's going to develop that throughout his letter. And I think in part this is what got Paul into hot waters, is some of the things he had to say about the Torah. For Paul, Israel has the law in Romans chapter 2. They have the written law. He says that in the law is the embodiment of knowledge and truth. And that language of knowledge and truth is what Gentiles know in chapter 1. Yeah, Israel has this embodiment of the knowledge and truth that Gentiles and humans have in their written Torah. And yet Paul is in chapter 2 going to criticize his fellow Jewish you for violating the Torah also, just like the Gentiles violated the Adamic law. So they're no better off for Paul. But if Paul is addressing Jews who think they have some kind of favor, or that the Torah rescues them from the wrath to come, or that it's the antidote to human sin, which was a rabbinic view, was that God gave the Torah as the antidote to the evil heart, which is fascinating. Paul, I think, is saying, actually, no, it didn't work that way. In fact, Paul's going to say that the Torah, just like Adam's law, has resulted in both sin and death. He thinks it participates in the same problem. But in chapter 2, because Paul is responding to Jews who are judging Gentiles of Romans chapter 1, right? You can imagine the interlocutor in chapter 2 as Paul, is describing how godless and terrible the Gentiles are in chapter 1. You imagine his Jewish kind of synagogue audience going, yeah, those Gentiles, they're bad, they're terrible. And then Paul turns, right? So they're judging the Gentiles, these Jews are, but Paul is going to turn in order to judge them in chapter 2. He wants to flip the judgment. And the way he does it is quite fascinating, actually. He's going to say that Gentiles who don't have the written law, right, those who are apart from the law, he's going to say that they have the law written on their heart. And so I think what he's doing is he's taking these Gentiles who were idolatrous and sinful and now making them to, I think he's drawing from Jeremiah 31, where the promise of the new covenant is the inscription of Israel's law on the heart. He's drawing from Deuteronomy 30, the circumcision of the heart by the Spirit. He's drawing from Ezekiel 36 and 37, where God will put his Spirit within them. And he's taking these godless Gentiles who now look, it appears now that there are some Gentiles who, even though they don't have the written law that you Israelites have, right? Paul says to his fellow kinsmen, these Gentiles have the law written in their hearts. They're circumcised in spirit, and they keep the commandments. And they, he says, are going to judge you who are circumcised and yet don't keep the commandments. That's how kind of Romans 2 ends.
Yeah.
But the reason I think he can say that they keep, these Gentiles essentially keep the requirements of the Torah, even though they're not circumcised, is because they have a version of the Torah that is tantamount in its requirements of justice to the written Torah, which is the Adamic law, Adam's law. That's what they essentially, the righteousness they fulfill.
And I guess that then sets up the kind of leveling that happens, where in Romans 3 that all have sinned, right? Like you end up with one sinning according to Adam's wisdom, one sinning according to Israel's law, and that in both cases then now everyone is in equal need. That's kind of the direction of travel here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think Paul has to work really hard, though, to explain, at least in even in Romans 3, is to leverage the law, the written law, as offering testimony that I don't think he has worked that hard to argue that Gentiles are sinful, but that even Israel is under sin, that the Torah gives testimony to that as well. And I think that's an important part of his argument. In fact, it's not simply for Paul that the law could not be kept by Israel, but that for Paul, law, not only Israel's law, but Adam's law as well, has resulted in the cosmic reigns of sin and death. And that's what I then develop in chapter 5 and in chapter 7.
Could you say a little bit about that? Because that has always been a part of Romans that I found rather perplexing. So how does Paul develop that argument?
Yeah, so in Romans 5, we get Paul talking, he makes this repeated comparison between Adam and Christ. So we get language like in verse 12, therefore, just as sin came to the world through one human and death through sin, and so death spread to all, so that all have sinned. Sin was indeed in the world before the law. And the question here is, which law are we talking about?
Right.
So this is, basically the vast majority of commentators are going to read this as before Israel's law, sin was already in the world, but somehow sin wasn't reckoned. One of the arguments I'm making in the book when I'm reading Romans 5 is to say, well, actually, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I don't think. I don't think it works really well to say that death reigns before Moses, is what Paul says. But then before Moses, sin was not reckoned. I have a hard time squaring those two things. And I think maybe, and I think interpreters come up with all kinds of creative solutions to this. It's because they really want the law, right, that he's talking about here to be the law of Moses primarily or exclusively. And I think we can solve this if we think that he's talking about law's arrival to the world and its encounter with Adam. Which would then include Moses' law. I think like Paul is speaking about law coming and arriving to the world, first encountering Adam, but it comes to the whole world, and it comes to Israel through Moses. But I think Paul's focus here is primarily on law's encounter with the first human and the catastrophe that engulfed the whole world. When law came, sin, he says, sin was in the world. Right. And I think we should be thinking of the story of Genesis, of something like the serpent lurking there in the garden.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sin's there in the world, but
Interesting.
it's not yet ruling the world, right? It's not yet
Mm,
gotten its dominion. But when the commandment comes, when in Genesis chapter 2, right, when the law
mm,
comes, God's law comes, sin finds its opportunity, and it's able then for Paul to unite with death, and they form a kind of allied
mm.
imperial reign over the whole world.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so all humans become captured under the reigns of sin and death when law arrives. And for Paul, I think Israel's law participates in that same problem. It's too weak to
Mm,
rescue humans from the calamity, from the rule of sin and death. And not only is it too weak and powerless, but even Paul says death reigned from Adam to Moses. That means including Moses and his people.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Moses' law was not able to rescue people from the reigns of sin and death. And in fact, I think Paul would say that Moses' law even recapitulates the problem that came when Adam's law came. So he
Yeah.
can blend the two together, but then also speak of them, distinctly when he needs to.
Okay. So, and last question, you bring up Eve's desire, and that's kind of the kind of the hook or the mechanism by which sin and death enter the world. So, for Paul and other first century interpreters, what is going on in that kind of moral psychology involved with something like Eve's desire? First, what do you mean by that, and how does
Yeah.
that play out in the psychology that they're developing?
Yeah. So by talking about Romans 7 as a moral psychological account, I'm suggesting that Paul is participating in ancient Jewish and even like Greco-Roman analyses of the human psyche, so to speak, of a particular moral condition, even where
Mm,
the human being becomes enveloped, entombed in vices and sins and unable to do the good they know how to do. So this is the kind of moral psychological condition that Paul is thinking about. Again,
mm,
unlike Ben Sira and even Fourth Ezra, who's fairly pessimistic also, Paul thinks that humans, when they encounter God's law or commandment, they become enslaved by sin and death, and they cannot rule over their bodies to do the good they know how to do. That's
mm,
how I read Romans 7.
mhm.
So I think it's Eve's voice, and this is not to exclude Adam, right? But Eve is the voice who Paul channels in Romans 7 as he kind of channels the voice of an I who voices this moral catastrophe. In some other Jewish texts, we have this idea that the human mind, can rule over the passions and the body.
Yeah.
And again, other
Right.
texts tend to be a bit more optimistic about this. But Paul is going to say that the mind, kind of knows what it ought to do. But what we read in Romans 7 is that we get this language of desire, and even every desire pops
Mm,
up. And we get language of passions
mm,
that rule the eye, so that the eye basically dies. And this death, I think, is this idea of it's a point that Emma Wasserman has made, I think, really well. She's pointed to this tradition that we see in Philo called the death of the soul,
mm,
where the eye is unable to do the good it should do. I think for Paul, this is every human being. It's not only some people, it's not only especially immoral Gentiles, but this is everyone. And in Romans 7, he says he's writing to those who know the law,
mm,
which means I think he's addressing his fellow Jews. Again, if we imagine Paul in the synagogue speaking to those who know the law, right? He's
mhm,
telling them that even they who know the law, when they encounter the 10th commandment, that the law has not resulted in life and righteousness. It has resulted in the death of the soul, even,
mm.
so that they've been unable to fulfill it and do it. Why desire? In some Jewish texts, desire can become the root of all sin.
Mm,
Okay, so, and I think that's what we see here is the I says in verse 7, I would not have known what it is to covet, or in Greek, what it is to desire, if the law had not said, you shall not desire. That's the 10th commandment that we often translate, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me every desire. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died, and the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. So I think we have here the voice of Eve. In Genesis, we read that Eve saw that the tree was desirable to make one wise. And I think that makes a connection for us with the 10th commandment, which commands, you shall not desire. And so the picture we have is this voice of Eve. And I think, again, this is not just about Eve, the first human, right? Eve is representing the Jewish experience, the Gentile experience, every human's experience. When everyone basically encounters God's command, because this tradition of Adam's law, right? And you could think of the 10th commandment as the commandment that encapsulates all of them. So you shall not desire, you could say that the commandment, you shall not murder, is a prohibition of desire. You shall not steal is a prohibition of desire. You shall not commit adultery is a prohibition of desire. And the reason is because desire, what happens is if you don't rule over your desire, if desire takes root and it becomes inflamed, it results in trespass and transgression. And I think that's the picture we have of the eye here. The eye encounters God's commandment, the 10th commandment here. And what does sin do? Sin is lurking there, right? The serpent we talked about earlier, but here it's sin is lurking there. And when that commandment comes to Eve or to Adam, you shall not desire, you shall not eat of this tree. What does the serpent do? It inflames Eve's desire. The tree became desirable to make her wise, and she takes and eats of it.
Yeah.
So I think the picture here, the moral psychology, is this is what happens to the human person, to every Adamic eye, so to speak. They encounter God's commandment, the prohibition against desire, and then sin is such a sneaky thing that it's even able to use the good commandment that is holy, righteous, and good to inflame every desire so that the human can't but basically transgress and sin. The human mind can't control the body. Rather, it's sin and desire and passions that rule over the body.
Yeah. And I suppose then that it's the universal significance of by rooting this in both Adam and Moses, in both wisdom and Torah, that it's the universality of that reality then sets the stage for Paul for the universality of Christ as the one who can bring reconciliation to everyone, Gentile and Jew alike, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Is that for Paul, right? The solution is Christ for both Jews and Gentiles. And that's what we read in Romans. I think in Romans 8, we learn about that, right? So the idea that the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ from the law of sin and death. And I take it, my reading of this is that the law of the Spirit of life is the reign of the Spirit of life. Another way to take it is it's the new covenant that Paul has in view, Ezekiel 36, Jeremiah 31. To be under the reign of the Spirit and under the reign of Christ is what Paul thinks his hearers need to be under, which liberates people from the reign of sin, death, and law. And paradoxically, they now in Romans 8 fulfill the righteous requirements of the law who walk according to the.
Yeah. Well, Rony, thank you for this fascinating analysis of the natural law tradition as it shows up in early Judaism and in the work of the Apostle Paul, and the ways that sets the stage for all kinds of things and aspects of Paul's thought. So thank you very much for this really insightful book. It's a very interesting read. Pick it up today at BaylorPress.com. Rony Kozman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.